Hey guys, today I'll be talking about schizophrenia. Today I'll be talking about schizophrenia and why I don't believe that it's you're wired differently mental illness kind of thing. I actually believe it's related to copper toxicity, and I'll be showing evidence of that, and hopefully at the end of the video I will have convinced every single one of you that it is actually just copper toxicity. So the first thing that got me interested in if schizophrenia is actually a real mental disorder or not is I was looking at videos of schizophrenics on YouTube, and I couldn't help but notice that every single one of them had a yellow undertone to their skin and black eyeshadows around their eyes. Now, this isn't true for every schizophrenic, but I was noticing this in a large portion of them, and it kind of got me thinking, what if it's a physiological issue that is not genetic and is not, intrinsic or innate from birth, per se, right? And that's the other thing. A lot of schizophrenic symptoms don't appear from the birth. They appear later in life, or in adolescence or during puberty, which I find very interesting. I also got my hands on this paper called the Copper Theory of Schizophrenia, and it was debunked in the conclusion, where they said that it's not good enough or whatever. Their reasoning, however, was based on how dopamine works in the brain, and how if you took copper away from the brain, you wouldn't get the same results as you would in the studies. The reasoning doesn't even tie into if copper is in the brain in these schizophrenics directly. It just talks about how they use dopamine as a proxy, as a proof that it wouldn't be in the brain. The only issue with the conclusion is that it's outdated science. We now know how dopamine and serotonin work, and it's a reuptake issue. It's not necessarily a sensitivity receptor issue like the paper suggests. So the entire reason for debunking the whole theory that schizophrenia is a copper issue, in my opinion, is outdated and irrelevant to today's science. So now I'm going to try and convince you that schizophrenia is a copper-related disorder, and it is entirely related to copper. So the first thing I want to look up here is okay, let me ask ChatGPT, because I know how Grok is sometimes. So where does copper accumulate in the brain the easiest? I'm just using ChatGPT because from my own practice, it's gotten good enough to know the correct answers to these things. Basal ganglia. Talks about the basal ganglia. It's a common thing for copper excess, copper disorders. For example, Wilson's disease. Okay. Now I'm going to do something real quick. I'm going to open a PDF of copper and schizophrenia. And I'm going to go through this with you, because I think this is very interesting. First of all, what I want to point to is I just want to see. Okay, so I can just look this up. See. Yes, here. Until recently, Wilson's disease was often misdiagnosed as schizophrenia. So what they're saying is Wilson's disease, which is a genetic disorder related to the ATP7A gene, I believe. I don't know if it says it here. I don't know. It's either ATP7A or ATP7B. I think it's ATP7. It could be ATP7B actually. I don't know. It's one of those two. But it's those genes are related to copper transport. And with Wilson's disease, the copper transport is completely fucked. So you get an accumulation of copper in the liver and in the brain. So it's very interesting that it says, until recently, Wilson's disease was also often misdiagnosed as schizophrenia. It's saying that schizophrenia and Wilson's disease have such similar symptoms, they couldn't tell the differences between them, right? Which is astounding to me. Another thing that I want to point your attention to is what they found in these schizophrenia patients when they gave them certain things that bind copper. For example, they gave them D-penicillamine. Here. The penicillamine did control melanogenesis in the schizophrenics. So what they found, what they're referring to is there was like these melanin things in schizophrenics, hyperproduction of melanin. Guess what else is related to that? Guess what else is related to melanin production? Copper, right? Also here, I just want to read this because I actually found this interesting. They autopsied 2 schizophrenics who had died after developing a peculiar metallic bluish-brown pigmentation of the exposed skin. Bluish-brown, that's purple. What is copper in the body? It's purple, right? I mean, come on. Like, let me just look this up. Copper powder, right? Look at that. Is that blue? If anything, that's very blue. Yeah. I don't know. I think this is like when it gets oxidized probably, but yeah. I mean, bluish brown. I mean, it's probably a mix of this and this, right? Which is copper. And it says here, the penicillamine, which binds to copper, by the way, did control melanogenesis in schizophrenia, but it also had an unexpected side effect, a noticeable improvement of the schizophrenic symptoms. So it basically started, fixing the schizophrenics. As soon as they were given penicillamine, which is copper chelator, right? Also binds to other stuff, but it's mainly for copper. And it says, apparently the schizophrenia was remitting along with the reduction in bodily levels of copper. It says, these results prompted Nicholson, Greiner, and Berry to study copper chelation in schizophrenia more thoroughly. Once again, the copper chelating agent was D-penicillamine. And it talks about another study here. It's extremely schizophrenic into 2 groups. Double-blind design. Control group of 5 was given placebos. The experimental group was given 1,200 milligrams of D-penicillamine daily, and their diets were limited to low copper intake. Mineral supplement was also administered because it's virtually impossible to construct a diet with solar copper. The subjects were rated every 6 days by psychiatrists and 2 psychiatric nurses. All 5 schizophrenics treated with D-penicillamine improved significantly, but none of the controls improved. This should be evidence enough that schizophrenia is actually just related to copper, right? And then again, this was replicated, reported similar findings from Hoffer and Osmond. In addition, 3 successful replications followed. This, and Ozek et al., I guess. Oh yeah, this one here. However, 3 other attempted replications failed entirely, and 2 produced positive results, but at a lower than typical placebo rate. Yes, that's the other thing. There were some controls in the schizophrenic population that didn't respond at all. But I guess one of the things that I have to ask is, in the paper, it states that only the acute short-term cases actually kind of, improved. I would suspect, though, that, the longer the copper sits in your body, the more poisoned you get, the harder it is for your body to actually take it out of the system, right? So yeah. Yeah, that's just some of the stuff here, I guess. And the other thing is that copper in the brain, it influences how dopamine works. So because copper mainly accumulates in the basal ganglia, that's like where the midbrain is. I can show you, actually. Basal ganglia. It's also where OCD is as well, and ADHD is produced. Yes. I want to find a nice photo. I guess I'll show this one. Yeah, so the basal ganglia consists of striatum, all this, substantia nigra, thalamus, all accumulates in here. This is where copper is most sensitive to for some reason. And the basal ganglia, or like, I guess the striatum area or whatever, it has these projections to the frontal lobes, the occipital lobes, right? And I guess it's the way that dopamine works in the brain is it has these dopaminergic pathways. So if we're using an example of ventral tegmental area to nucleus accumbens, there's like a mesolimbic dopamine pathway that goes through there. And it's the same for all of this, basically. I can't remember if it's just like white matter tracks. It probably is, maybe. I'm not too sure. But there's definitely pathways in the brain for this kind of stuff. The other thing is that copper influences methylation throughout the entire body. There's substantial evidence to show that it actually increases SAH, which is S-adenosyl homocysteine. And the way that a lot of practitioners actually read out your total methylation is by looking at the SAM to SAH ratio, which is the S-adenosyl methionine to S-adenosyl homocysteine ratio. And, when SAH is high, it can create a ratio that is more similar to an undermethylation ratio, because their SAM is low and SAH is high, so it creates a very small number, basically. because the denominator is bigger than the numerator. With the amount of copper, if you have too much copper in the brain, it's going to affect stuff like the motor cortex and motor movement, and that's what you see with Wilson's disease. But if you have a smaller amount of copper in the brain, it can create other symptoms, and that's where I believe schizophrenia comes in. Schizophrenia symptoms. Delusions, hallucinations, disorganized speech, lack of initiative, reduced speech, flattened affect. Also some other stuff, very low processing speed, very bad at schoolwork, very bad at focusing, very bad at remaining attentive to things, right? I mean, that's also related to ADHD, right? Strong false beliefs despite contrary evidence. Disorganized speech. Abnormal motor behavior. Unpredictable or bizarre movements. I mean, this is all symptoms coming from the basal ganglia. All this stuff is related to the caudate nucleus. It's like an OCD kind of thing that occurs where you reprocess thought loops. That's another thing with schizophrenia. You have a racing mind, right? Reduced emotional expression. Inability to experience pleasure. The thing is, with copper in the brain, it can actually damage dopamine in the brain and lower it. And what happens is it also lowers methylation of SLC6A4, which is the gene that codes for the serotonin uptake receptors, the SERT receptors or whatever. And basically, when you undermethylate something, you take the brakes off of it being transcribed. So when you undermethylate that gene, it just creates more of it. So there's too many. There are too many serotonin transporters in the brain in schizophrenia, and it leads to a symptomology of low serotonin, basically. Like I could ask Grok here, like, has methylation, I think it actually might be the other way around actually, has methylation of C6A4 been in schizophrenic patients? Okay, so yeah, it's hypermethylation. So it actually means there's too much serotonin, which actually makes more sense because you get like the delusions. And serotonin in excess in the brain, it actually causes it has a dissociative effect with anything in large amounts. So if you have too much serotonin in your brain, it creates a dissociative side effects. So you'll begin to believe in delusions and see things that aren't there, basically. Yeah. So those are my main points, I guess. The other thing is that they did a cadaver study on schizophrenics, and they found that the copper was increased in the caudate nucleus, which is part of the basal ganglia, is what we talked about earlier. Just looking that up now. So there's no significant differences were found in any region. The region-specific variations existed. So the substantia nigra, which is part of the basal ganglia, showed significantly lower copper content compared to controls. A key thing here is just because a substantia nigra has low levels of copper doesn't mean that other parts of the brain have excessive amounts, right? Talks about CRT1, it's called transport 1, and how there's lower amounts of it and how it's dysregulated in the brains of schizophrenics. And then here, this is the one I was trying to look for. On older data, they found that it was increased in the caudate nucleus. It's interesting that they didn't find that they didn't report on that again. It's almost like they're trying to cover it up. I don't know. But yeah, the caudate nucleus, that is part of the basal ganglia. So it checks out with the copper theory. Yeah. Yeah, that's just my video on schizophrenia. I hope it was insightful, and I hope I open up your mind to what it actually could be caused by. I do believe that it is copper in the brain, and it poisons the CRT1 transport proteins, and it causes dysregulation in the copper in different regions of the basal ganglia. So like in the substantia nigra, you have very low levels, and in the caudate nucleus you have much higher levels. And then that still creates abnormalities in the brain of these people. Yes, so that's all I wanted to say. Thank you for watching.